I had just settled into seat 2A when a shadow fell over my book. A man in an expensive suit was staring down at me, his face a mask of impatient disdain. "You're confused," he said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "This is first class. Economy is in the back, Grandma." He saw a lost old woman in a simple cardigan. He had no idea who I was. The jet bridge was a gray tube, filled with cool air that smelled faintly of exhaust and rain. My soft-soled shoes made no sound on the carpeted ramp. I kept a steady pace, holding the strap of my purse on one shoulder and my small roller bag in my other hand. The bing-bong of the boarding scanner echoed ahead. I reached the aircraft door. A young flight attendant with a smile that looked bolted in place greeted me. "Welcome aboard Apex Flight 76, she said. Her eyes flicked from my face down to my beige cardigan, then back up. The smile did not change, but her eyes were professional and empty. "Thank you," I said, and stepped inside. I turned left into the quiet, wide aisle of the first-class cabin. The lighting was soft, tinted a calm blue. The seats were large, dark blue pods, separated by polished wood-grain dividers. It was clean. I could smell the faint chemical scent of leather polish and the aroma of fresh coffee from the galley. My seat was 2A, window. I stopped and easily lifted my small bag into the overhead bin. It was mostly empty. I did not need much. I slid into the seat. The leather was cool and firm against my back. I found the controls on the small panel and adjusted the lumbar support. A small, quiet whir came from inside the seat as it pressed gently into my lower back. I settled in, fastening the wide, clean seatbelt across my lap. It clicked firmly into place. From my purse, I pulled my paperback. The cover was creased, and the pages were soft, almost like fabric. It was a mystery novel. I had read it half a dozen times, but I loved the characters. The cabin slowly filled. The sounds of boarding were familiar. The low rumble of roller bags on the aisle carpet, the solid snap of overhead bins closing, the murmur of quiet conversations. From the galley in front of me, I heard the clink of glass and ice. A man in a sharp blue suit stuffed his coat into the bin across from me. He handled it with extreme care, smoothing it against the wall of the bin, his brow furrowed in concentration. A woman with very bright blonde hair sat in 1A, already tapping furiously on her phone, her thumb a blur. The screen cast a blue light on her face. The chaos grew. The line in the aisle was slow. People were trying to find space for bags that were clearly too large. The junior flight attendant walked back and forth, her smile looking a little more strained, her voice a little too high. "Sir, I'm afraid that will have to be checked." I found my page and started to read. I tuned out the noise, focusing on the words. I was good at waiting. A shadow fell over my book. I finished my sentence before looking up. A man was standing in the aisle, blocking the light. He was in his late 40s, tall, and he carried an energy that made the air around him feel tight. His dark hair was combed back, stiff with some product. His white shirt was so crisp it looked like it could cut paper. He was not looking at the empty seat next to me. He was staring directly at me. His eyes were dark and impatient. He cleared his throat. It was a loud, deliberate sound. Ahem, I waited. "You're in my way," he said. His voice was flat and deep. He spoke as if I were a piece of luggage someone had forgotten in the aisle. I slowly placed my bookmark, a simple, folded airline receipt, between the pages and closed the book, resting it in my lap. "I do beg your pardon?" I asked. He sighed, a loud theatrical sound of pure frustration. He tapped his ticket against the polished gold watch on his wrist. Tap, tap. "This," he said, holding the ticket out, "is 2B, the aisle." "My seat." He then pointed a sharp finger at me. "You are in the window. You need to get up. Let me in." He spoke slowly, as if I were hard of hearing. Or perhaps, I thought, as if I were stupid. I am in 2A, sir, I replied, keeping my voice even. The man in the blue suit across the aisle glanced over, then quickly looked away. You are 2B. We are seatmates. I made a small gesture toward the empty seat. If you will just give me a moment, I can unbuckle and stand so you can— He laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was short and sharp like a bark. No, I don't think so. He leaned in. He was too close. I could smell his cologne. It was a heavy, spicy scent, overwhelming in the enclosed space. I think you're confused, he said, his voice dropping to a loud, conspiratorial whisper that the entire front cabin could hear. His eyes scanned me, from my worn shoes, up my simple trousers, and lingered on my favorite cardigan. His lip curled. This, he said, waving his free hand in a broad gesture at the cabin, is first class, not economy. I stared back at him. I did not move. I did not speak. He took my silence as confusion. You're lost, Grandma, he said, his voice now full of fake, sugary pity. Coach is in the back of the plane. You need to go back there. He straightened up, his face hardening again. Now get out of the seat. You're holding up the whole plane. My hand rested on my book. The man's cologne was so strong it made my nose itch. I could feel the eyes of the other passengers. They were not looking at their phones anymore. They were looking at us. The cabin, which had been filled with the low rumble of boarding, was now quiet. Sir, I said, my voice low and steady. There is no need to raise your voice. I am in the correct seat. This is 2A. And I am telling you, you are not. He boomed. He was not just speaking to me. He was performing. He turned his head slightly, addressing the passengers in row 1, the man in the blue suit across the aisle. Can you believe this? I pay $5,000 for a ticket, and I have to argue with someone who's wandered in from the back. He gestured to me, his hand open, as if presenting evidence. Look at her. She's obviously confused. This is not her seat. My cardigan was beige. My trousers were simple. My hair was gray. I knew what he saw. He saw an old woman who did not have $5,000 for a plane ticket. He saw someone who did not belong. Sir, I tried again. You are making a scene. I'm making a scene? He laughed again, that sharp, ugly sound. You're the one trespassing in a first-class cabin. You're the one causing a delay. He was right about the delay. The line of passengers behind him had stopped. A man with a briefcase sighed loudly. A woman further back stood on her toes, trying to see the problem. The junior flight attendant, the one with the tight smile, hurried over. Her name tag read Sarah. She looked very young, and her eyes were wide with stress. Is there a problem here, sir? She asked, her voice trembling just a little. She looked at him, then at me, then back at him. She was trying to figure out who was the threat. The man immediately turned on her. He stood up even straighter, puffing out his chest. He was much taller than her. Yes, there's a problem, he snapped. Your airline's boarding procedure is a joke. You've let this woman wander up here from coach, and she's refusing to move. She's in the wrong seat. Sarah looked at me. Her eyes were pleading. Ma'am? Can I see your boarding pass, please? Of course, I said. I reached into my purse, but before I could even pull out the ticket, the man interrupted. Oh, for God's sake, don't bother her, he said. She's just a confused old grandma. Just take her hand or her elbow or whatever you do and walk her back to economy. Seat 42E or something. Go on. We're all waiting. He crossed his arms, satisfied. He had solved the problem. He had given the order. Sarah was frozen. She looked at me, then at him. Sir, I can't just assume what you can't assume, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Use your eyes. Does she look like she belongs here? I am a Diamond Apex member. I fly this route twice a month. I know who sits up here. She is not one of them. He was loud. So loud. The man in the blue suit was now visibly cringing. The woman in 1A was holding her phone up, not quite pointing it at us, but not pointing it away either. I heard a small digital click, She was taking a picture. I am trying to be polite here, the man continued, his face starting to turn a dull, blotchy red. But my patience is gone. Get her out, now. Sir, Sarah said, her voice stronger now, though she was still pale. You are harassing another passenger. I need you to please lower your voice. Harassing? He yelled. I'm the one being harassed. By a senile old woman in my seat. This is unacceptable. I want your supervisor. Get me the purser. Get me someone who can actually handle this. You're clearly not qualified. He pointed a finger at her name tag. I will be reporting you, Sarah. Sarah flinched, as if he had physically pushed her. She took a half step back. She was completely overwhelmed. She looked toward the galley at the front of the plane, her eyes searching for help. The man saw her look. He grinned, a thin, tight smile of victory. That's right. Go get your boss. He turned back to me. His eyes were cold and hard. You've caused enough trouble, old woman. Your little adventure is over. I simply looked at him. I held my book in my lap. I did not move. I did not unbuckle my seatbelt. From the galley, I heard a sharp, decisive footstep. It was different from the flight attendant's quick, light steps. This was a measured, solid sound. A tall woman in the crisp, dark blue purser's uniform appeared. Her hair was pulled back into a perfect, severe bun. Her face was calm, but her eyes were not. Her eyes were like ice. She walked directly toward our row. The man smiled, ready to finally get what he wanted. The man smiled. It was a smile of pure triumph. He had won. Finally, he said to the purser, his voice booming with relief. Someone who knows what they're doing. He pointed at me, a sharp, accusing jab of his finger, but he kept his eyes locked on the woman in the dark blue uniform. This woman, he declared, is lost. She's sitting in 2A. She belongs in coach. I've told her. He waved a dismissive hand at Sarah, the junior attendant, and neither one of them will do anything about it. Sarah here is completely incompetent. I am a Diamond member. I fly this route twice a month, and I want this person removed, now. He crossed his arms, leaning back slightly on his heels, waiting for his order to be followed. The purser's name tag read Chloe. She had not looked at him. She had not acknowledged his presence. She walked right past his shoulder, as if he were a coat rack, and stopped, standing perfectly straight, directly in front of my seat. The man's smile faltered. He was in the middle of saying something else, and another thing. But his voice trailed off. The air in the cabin was so still I could hear the faint hiss of the ventilation system. Chloe's face was not the professional mask of the other flight attendant. It was a look of deep, genuine concern. She looked horrified. She bent at the waist, just slightly. It was not a bow, but it was an unmistakable gesture of deference. "Madam Owner," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear. It cut through the entire cabin. Every single passenger heard it. The man, the one who had been shouting, froze. His arms were still crossed, but the confident posture was gone. "Madam Owner," Chloe said again, her voice full of a deep, professional apology. "I am mortified. I heard the commotion from the galley. We are so sorry for this disturbance." She then glanced over her shoulder at the man. It was a quick, cold look, a look you would give to something you found on the bottom of your shoe. "We will have him removed immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than before, thick with shock. The man, Harrison, let his arms fall slowly to his sides. His face, which had been red and blotchy with anger, went completely, suddenly white. He looked like he was going to be sick. "What?" he whispered. His voice was a dry croak. "What did you—" "Call her?" This time, Chloe turned her whole body to face him. She stood up to her full height. Her face was blank. All emotion was gone. It was a cold, empty mask of professionalism that was far more frightening than any anger. "I called her Madam Owner, sir," Chloe said. Her voice was flat and hard. Harrison just stared, his mouth hanging open. Chloe continued. "This is Evelyn Devereaux." She let the name hang in the air for a second. "The owner of this airline. And you," she said, her voice dropping, "have been harassing her in front of the entire cabin." I saw the junior flight attendant, Sarah. Her hands flew to her mouth, and her eyes, already wide, seemed to double in size. The woman in 1A with the phone slowly, very slowly, lowered it to her lap, her own face pale. The man in the blue suit across the aisle looked like he wanted to slide under his seat. Harrison made a small, gasping sound. "Owner, no, he was babbling. He could not form a word. He looked from Chloe's hard face to my quiet one. The power in the aisle had shifted. It was a physical thing. He was no longer the tall, important man. He looked small. He looked like a child who had been caught setting a fire. "Security is on its way, Madame Devereaux," Chloe said to me, pulling a small communication device from her uniform pocket. "We will not tolerate any passenger treating you this way." "No," Harrison yelped. The word was high-pitched, desperate. "No, please, don't. I apologize." He turned to me, his hands now held up, palms forward. It was a gesture of complete surrender. "Ma'am, Mrs. Devereaux, I am so sorry. I had no idea. It was just a misunderstanding. I just thought, you were—" He stopped, his mouth working silently, realizing that every possible excuse only confirmed his guilt. He stood there, trembling, his expensive suit suddenly looking too big for him. Chloe waited, her device in her hand. Sarah waited, her hand still over her mouth. The entire cabin waited, silent, watching me. They were all waiting for my answer. I looked at Mr. Harrison. His face was slick with a thin layer of sweat. He was breathing quickly, his chest rising and falling under the crisp white shirt. He wasn't the loud, important man from 5 minutes ago. He was just a very scared, very embarrassed person. His eyes darted from me to Chloe, then back to me. He was waiting for my judgment. I held his gaze for a long moment. I did not feel anger. I just felt a quiet sense of finality. I turned my head to Chloe. She stood tall, her device still in her hand, her expression perfectly neutral, waiting for my command. "That won't be necessary, Chloe," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the silence it carried. Chloe's eyebrows raised just a fraction. "Madam, he doesn't need to be removed," I said. "I'm sure the gentleman, Mr. Harrison, has just realized his mistake." I turned my gaze back to the man. He flinched. "He'll be very, very quiet for the remainder of the flight," I said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. I looked directly into his eyes. "Won't you, sir?" He could not speak. He just nodded, a fast, jerky motion. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Devereaux. Absolutely. Quiet. Very quiet." "Then there is no problem," I said simply. I looked at Chloe. "Thank you, Chloe. You can tell security to stand down. Let's please get the other passengers boarded. We're holding up the flight." Chloe hesitated. She clearly did not like the decision, but she was a professional. She nodded once, a sharp, clean movement. "As you wish, Madam Owner." She put her device away and cast one last, cold look at Mr. Harrison. "Take your seat, sir. And do not speak to Madame Devereaux again." "Yes, of course. Thank you," he stammered. He moved like an old man, his limbs stiff and uncoordinated. He grabbed his briefcase from the aisle, his hands fumbling with the handle. He avoided my eyes. He did not look at my simple cardigan or my old book. He looked at the floor, at the wall, at the seat controls, anywhere but at me. He slid into 2B. It was a slow, careful process, as if he were trying to make himself as small as possible. He did not want to brush against my arm. He pressed himself against the aisle-side divider. He fumbled with his seatbelt, his hands shaking. I heard the click as he finally buckled it. Then he laced his fingers together on his lap, pressed his knees tightly together, and stared straight ahead at the bulkhead wall. He was rigid. The show was over. Around us, the cabin slowly came back to life. I heard the shuffle of feet in the aisle as the boarding line began to move. The man in the blue suit quickly busied himself with the in-flight magazine, his face hidden. The whispers started, low and urgent. Chloe leaned in close to me. Her uniform smelled faintly of starch and clean laundry. Her voice was now a respectful murmur, just for me. "Can I get you your usual pre-departure champagne, Madame Devereux?" she asked. I smiled up at her. "Just a water for now, dear. And thank you, Chloe. You handled that perfectly." "It was my pleasure, ma'am," she said. She straightened up and walked, with that same perfect posture, back to the galley. I took a breath. I opened my paperback and found my place. Beside me, Mr. Harrison did not move. He did not get a book. He did not look at his phone. He just stared at the wall, his knuckles white. The last passenger boarded. The overhead bins were closed with a series of solid, thudding sounds. The junior flight attendant, Sarah, walked by. She glanced at me and gave a small, nervous smile. I smiled back. The heavy cabin door was sealed with a thunk and the sound of the locking mechanism. The jet bridge moved away from the window. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft blue. The purser's voice came over the intercom, calm and welcoming. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Apex Flight 76. I settled in to read. Mr. Harrison, my seatmate, had not blinked. The plane hadn't even left the gate, and this was already the worst flight of his life. The engine settled into a deep, steady drone. It was a comforting sound, one I had known my entire adult life. The heavy jolt of the landing gear retracting was long past, and we were now a quiet pod, suspended in the dark, 35,000 feet above the earth. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed and switched off. Beside me, Mr. Harrison flinched at the sound. He had not moved since takeoff. His hands were still clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He stared at the blank, dark screen of the entertainment system in front of him. I continued to read. The cabin lights were soft. The air was cool and dry. After about an hour, the scent of warm food began to drift from the galley. It was a pleasant smell of herbs and roasted meat. The soft clinking of porcelain and silverware began. Chloe appeared, pushing a small, elegant cart. She moved with quiet efficiency. She stopped the cart just before our row and walked to my seat. She kneeled, bringing herself down to my level. It was a practiced, respectful gesture. "Madame Devereux," she said, her voice low and warm. "May I get you started with dinner? We have the grilled salmon with lemon and dill, or a wild mushroom risotto." "I believe you prefer the salmon," she remembered. Of course she did. Chloe was one of my best. "The salmon sounds wonderful, Chloe." "Thank you," I said, closing my book. "And to drink? Your usual?" "Just the water for now, thank you," I said. She smiled. "Of course." She rose, and in the same smooth motion, turned to Mr. Harrison. She did not kneel. She stood tall, her hands clasped, her face a mask of polite, impersonal service. "Sir, your dinner choice?" Mr. Harrison startled, as if woken from a dream. "What?" "Oh, He swallowed, his throat clicking. His voice was a dry, hoarse whisper. "The salmon, please, and a water. Just water." He did not look at her. He looked at his lap. "Very good, sir," Chloe said. She turned and went back to her cart. The junior flight attendant, Sarah, brought my tray first. She placed it on the divider, then carefully opened the small table from my armrest. She set the tray down with a soft thud. It was a real porcelain plate, not foil. The salmon was pink with a sprig of green dill on top. The vegetables were bright green. A small, real metal fork and knife were wrapped in a heavy linen napkin. "Thank you, Sarah," I said. She beamed, her earlier nervousness gone, replaced with genuine warmth. "You are so welcome, Mrs. Devereux. Please let me know if you need anything at all." Then, Chloe brought Mr. Harrison's tray. She set it down in front of him. It was the same meal, the same placement, but the action was different. It was quick, efficient, and cold. There was no warmth. It was a transaction. "Enjoy your meal," she said, and moved on. We ate in silence. The only sounds were the faint scrape of metal on ceramic and the steady drone of the engines. I ate my salmon. It was cooked perfectly, flaky and moist. Mr. Harrison picked at his food. He held his fork stiffly, like a tool he had never used before. He took a small bite of fish, chewed it slowly, then stared at his plate. Halfway through the meal, his hand slipped. His fork slid from his fingers and hit the porcelain plate with a loud clack, then bounced onto the hard floor of the cabin. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet. Mr. Harrison froze. His entire body went rigid. His eyes shut tight, as if bracing for a blow. He did not move to pick it up. Sarah was walking up the aisle, collecting trays from row 1. She stopped. She saw the fork on the floor. She looked at Mr. Harrison, who was now a pale, sweaty gray. She sighed, a small, quiet sound. "I'll get you a new one, sir." "Thank you," he whispered. He did not look at her. I'm sorry." She returned with a fresh, linen-wrapped fork and handed it to him. He took it, his fingers fumbling. "Thank you." She just nodded, her face polite but distant, and continued down the aisle. Mr. Harrison did not use the new fork. He just laid it on his tray. He was done eating. He just sat there, defeated, in front of his half-eaten meal. Hours passed. The cabin lights were dimmed to a deep, restful blue. Most passengers were asleep, their forms just lumps under the airline blankets. Some had the small, flickering lights of their movie screens. I finished my book, closed it, and put it in my purse. I leaned my seat back just a little, resting my eyes. Beside me, Mr. Harrison had not moved. He had not watched a movie. He had not read the magazine. He had not slept. His screen was dark. His hands were on his lap. He just sat there, awake, rigid, staring into the darkness. He was a statue of pure misery. After a while, I needed to use the restroom. I knew this would be difficult. I leaned over and said very quietly, "Excuse me, sir." He jumped so violently he hit his elbow on the armrest. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Devereaux. Of course." He fumbled with his seatbelt buckle, his hands shaking. He clicked it open and began to stand up, but he was clumsy in his haste. He moved too fast in the small space. His knee hit the stowed tray table with a loud thwack. "Ow! I'm sorry, he muttered, stumbling out into the aisle. He stood there, hunched over, pressing his back against the seats in row 1, trying to make himself invisible, to stay out of my way. I slid out of my seat easily. "Thank you," I said, walking past him. He just nodded at the floor, his face tight with pain and humiliation. When I returned from the brightly lit, clean-smelling lavatory, he was still standing there, in that same hunched, painful position, waiting for me. I stopped in the aisle. He looked at me. His eyes were desperate, red-rimmed, and pleading. He looked like a man at the end of his rope. He opened his mouth. His voice was a raw, broken whisper. "Mrs. Devereaux, please." I stood in the dark, quiet aisle. The air was cool. Mr. Harrison was hunched over, his face pale in the dim blue cabin light. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His eyes were red. "Please," he said again. His voice was a raw, cracked whisper. "Please what, Mr. Harrison?" I asked. My voice was not unkind. It was just steady. I am so ashamed." He wasn't loud. He wasn't performing. "I am so sorry. I was an animal. I don't know why I said those things. He stopped, struggling for the words. He looked down at his own polished shoes, then back up at me. "I assumed," he finally said. "I saw your clothes." I saw an old woman. I was stressed. I was arrogant. It was inexcusable. I know that, he was shaking. A managing director at a major bank, a man who probably terrified his employees, was visibly shaking in the aisle. I'll lose my job, he whispered, the words tumbling out. I know it. If you report this, my company, we have a contract with Apex, a major contract. I have a family. I have children, he was begging. He was a powerful man reduced to begging in the middle of the night, 35,000 feet in the air. I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. I saw the fear. I'm not interested in your job, Mr. Harrison, I said. He looked up, his eyes wide with a flicker of desperate hope. I didn't stop Chloe from removing you because I wanted to torture you for 6 hours, I continued, keeping my voice low. I did it because you were causing a spectacle. I dislike spectacles, and I wanted the flight to be on time. His face tensed, waiting. You were rude, I said, and you were unkind. Not just to me. You were cruel to Sarah. You treated that young woman like she was nothing. Like she was just a tool for you to use to get what you wanted. His face fell. He had forgotten about Sarah. You assumed, I said simply. You assumed many things. About me, about her. You see people, and you put them into boxes. You decide who belongs and who doesn't. You're right, he mumbled, looking at the floor. Yes, I'm sorry. I accept your apology, Mr. Harrison, I said. He let out a breath so large it was almost a sob. The relief washed over his face, making it look even paler. But, I said, and I stepped just a little closer. He flinched, but I kept my voice soft. I want you to remember this. This feeling, this shame. This feeling in your stomach right now. The next time you are on a plane, or in a restaurant, or anywhere, and you see someone. A waiter, a cleaner, an old woman in a cardigan, someone you think is less than you. I want you to remember this, and I want you to be kind. He nodded, his eyes shut tight. Yes, I will. I promise I will. Thank you, Mrs. Devereaux. Now, if you will please let me return to my seat, I said. We will be landing soon. Yes. Of course, I'm sorry. He practically fell back into his seat, 2B, moving quickly, scrambling to get out of my way. I sat down in 2A and fastened my belt. He sat beside me. He was still quiet, but the rigid, terrified posture was gone. He was deflated. He just looked old and very, very tired. About 20 minutes later, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, bright and alert. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival. The lights in the cabin came up, changing from the soft blue to a brighter, functional white. It felt sudden and harsh. I saw Chloe and Sarah walk the aisle, their movements quick and practiced. They collected the last few glasses. The bing-bong chimed. The fastened seatbelt sign lit up. I felt the familiar change in the engine's sound, the subtle shift as the plane tilted, the nose dipping down. My ears popped with the change in pressure. Outside my window, the blackness was gone. I could see the lights of Los Angeles, a vast glittering grid of white and gold spread out for miles below. We descended through a thin layer of clouds. The plane shuddered lightly. Beside me, Mr. Harrison's hands were gripping his armrests. He was staring at the bulkhead wall. The ground rushed up to meet us. The bright, clean lines of the runway appeared. There was a heavy thump as the wheels touched the tarmac. It was a good, solid landing. The reverse thrusters roared, a deep, vibrating sound that I felt in my chest. We slowed, the force pressing me gently into my seat. The plane turned off the runway and moved slowly toward the terminal. Welcome to Los Angeles, the pilot's voice said, where the local time is 10:45 p.m. We hope you've enjoyed your flight with Apex. We taxied for several minutes. The cabin was filled with the sounds of people waking up. I heard the click of seatbelts unbuckling, the beeps and chimes of phones turning on. The plane rolled to a final gentle stop at the gate. The engines wound down into silence. The final, cheerful bing-bong chimed. "You are now free to use your electronic devices," the intercom announced. Immediately, the man in row 1 stood up. The man in the blue suit across the aisle was grabbing his coat. Mr. Harrison did not move. I unbuckled my belt. I gathered my purse and my book. I stood up. Mr. Harrison looked up at me. He was still seated. "After you, Mrs. Devereaux, please." I nodded and stepped into the aisle, which was already filling. He stood up behind me. He reached into the overhead bin for his black briefcase. He fumbled with it. The cabin door opened with a whoosh of air. The passengers in front of us began to move. I took a step forward. "Mrs. Devereaux?" I paused and looked back at him. He was holding his briefcase in one hand. He looked awful. His suit was a mess, and his eyes were red. "The flight attendant," he said. His voice was low, so no one else could hear. "Sarah, should I apologize to her too?" The noise of the cabin was a low roar, the clicks of seatbelts, the zips of bags, the rustle of coats. Mr. Harrison stood in the aisle, his briefcase in one hand, his face a gray mask of exhaustion. "Should I apologize to her too?" he repeated. He meant Sarah. I looked at him. The line of passengers in front of me shuffled forward. I took a step with them. "I cannot answer that for you, Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "I am not the one whose job you threatened." His face tensed. He understood. It was not enough to apologize to the owner. It was not about power. It was about the act itself. "Excuse me," I said, and turned away from him. The line moved slowly. I shuffled forward, one step at a time. I could feel his presence behind me, a heavy, nervous energy. He was following me, but he was keeping his distance. We reached the front galley. The cabin door was wide open, spilling bright, yellowish light from the jet bridge. Chloe and Sarah were standing side by side, just inside the doorway. They were a team. Their faces were fixed with polite, professional smiles. "Good night." Sir," Chloe said to the man in the blue suit as he passed. "Thank you for flying with us," Sarah said to the woman with the blonde hair. I was next. I stopped in front of them. "Good night, Chloe," I said. "Good night, Madam Owner," she replied, her smile warm and genuine. "I hope the rest of your evening is more peaceful." "I am sure it will be," I said. I then turned to Sarah. She looked at me, her eyes bright. "And good night to you, Sarah." "Good night, Mrs. Devereaux," she said. It was an honor." I was about to step onto the jet bridge when Harrison's voice came from behind me. "Wait." I stopped. I did not turn around, but I listened. Sarah's professional smile faded. She looked at Mr. Harrison, her expression guarded. "Sir, can I help you?" The passengers behind him stopped, annoyed. I heard a man sigh. Mr. Harrison was blocking the aisle again. But this time it was different. He was not looking at me. He was looking directly at Sarah. "Miss Sarah," he said. His voice was thick. He had to clear his throat. I wanted to apologize." "To you?" Sarah's eyes widened. She was frozen. She glanced at Chloe, who stood perfectly still, her face unreadable. "What I said to you earlier," Harrison continued, his voice low and unsteady, when I called you incompetent, when I threatened you, it was wrong. It was a lie. You were professional. You were just doing your job." He was stammering, the words coming out in clumps. "I was an arrogant fool. I am deeply, truly sorry for how I treated you." The aisle was completely silent. The man who sighed was now just staring. Sarah looked at this powerful man, who was now hunched in his wrinkled suit, apologizing to her. She swallowed. "Thank you, sir," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. I accept your apology." Mr. Harrison nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. He looked relieved, but also deeply ashamed. "Thank you. Good night." He did not look at me. He did not look at Chloe. He turned, his briefcase hitting the side of the doorway, and walked quickly onto the jet bridge. He did not look back. He was just another man in a hurry, disappearing into the terminal. The line of passengers started moving again, shuffling past. I was the last one. I looked at Sarah. She was still a little stunned, but she looked lighter. I smiled at her. You handled an impossible situation with professionalism today, Sarah. You did very well, she beamed. Thank you, Mrs. Devereaux. Thank you. Chloe nodded at me, a small shared look of understanding. Have a safe drive home, madam. Good night, ladies, I said. I stepped out of the aircraft and onto the carpeted ramp. The air in the jet bridge was cool. I walked, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the floor. Ahead of me, the bright, noisy expanse of the terminal opened up. I saw the signs for baggage claim and ground transportation. I was just another traveler moving through the crowd. I pulled my small roller bag behind me, the wheels making a soft, rumbling sound. I was thinking about my car and the quiet drive home.